On the evening of August 15th, 1971, President Richard Nixon interrupted a Sunday night episode of Bonanza, one of the most watched television programs in America, to deliver a 16-minute address to the nation. Buried in the middle of a speech, mostly about wage and price freezes, was a single sentence that would quietly end the monetary system the entire world had operated under for 27 years. The United States, Nixon announced, would no longer convert dollars held by foreign governments into gold. No treaty was renegotiated. No constitutional amendment was passed. No vote was held in Congress. One weekend, a small group of advisors met in secret at Camp David, and by Monday morning, the financial promise backing every dollar on earth had simply ceased to exist. Most people who've heard of this moment know it as the end of the gold standard, and think of it as some inevitable, purely technical adjustment. What almost nobody appreciates is how deliberately secretive the decision was, how narrow the group making it actually was, and just how directly it was driven by other nations, quietly trying to cash in dollars they no longer trusted. You need to go back to the system built at Bretton Woods in 1944, which had pegged the US dollar to gold at $35 an ounce, with every other major currency pegged to the dollar in turn. For years, this arrangement worked reasonably well, in large part because the United States held such an overwhelming share of the world's monetary gold that the promise to convert dollars into gold on demand. But by the late 1960s, that overwhelming gold advantage had eroded dramatically. Years of financing the Vietnam War and an expanding domestic welfare state through deficit spending meant the United States was printing far more dollars than its gold reserves could actually back. Foreign governments, most notably France under Charles de Gaulle, began to notice. De Gaulle's government made a pointed decision. As the Bretton Woods system assumed nations would, France began systematically presenting those dollars to the United States, Treasury, and demanding actual gold in return, exactly as the rules technically allowed. A French naval vessel is said to have made the crossing specifically to collect gold bullion, a symbolic act that made unmistakably clear what de Gaulle thought of Washington's expanding money printing. Other nations, watching America's gold reserves shrink and its trade balance deteriorate, grew nervous enough to start doing the same. Between 1949 and 1971, U.S. gold reserves fell from roughly $20 billion worth to just over $10 billion, while the amount of dollars held by foreign central banks kept climbing. The math had become impossible. If every dollar, theoretically claimable by a foreign government, had actually been presented for gold at once, the United States Treasury vault would have emptied out many times over. By the summer of 1971, the pressure had become acute. Treasury Secretary John Connally and a small circle of Nixon's closest economic advisors, including a young Federal Reserve official named Paul Volcker, understood that a genuine run on American gold reserves. Nixon convened his advisors at Camp David on the weekend of August 13th through 15th, a meeting held in near-total secrecy, with staff reportedly told to keep even their own families in the dark about where the president actually was. Over that single weekend, groups settled on a sweeping package of measures, a 90-day freeze on wages and prices, a new import surcharge, and, most consequentially of all, the closing of what was called the gold window, ending the direct convertibility of dollars into gold for foreign governments once and for all. What makes this moment so remarkable is not simply the substance of the decision, but the process behind it. This was arguably one of the most consequential pieces of global economic policy of the entire 20th century, unilaterally ending an international monetary agreement that dozens of nations had built their own financial systems around. And it was decided by a handful of men for a single weekend, announced to the public in a television address interrupting a Western drama, with no international consultation beforehand at all. Foreign governments learned what the United States had decided about their own currency reserves largely by watching the same broadcast everyone else did. The immediate global reaction was chaos. Currency markets that had operated for nearly 3 decades under the assumption of dollar convertibility to gold had no established mechanism for what came next. Foreign exchange markets shut down entirely for several days as governments scrambled to figure out how their own currencies should now be valued against a dollar that floated freely for the first time since the war. Attempts were made over the following 2 years to patch together a new fixed exchange rate system. But by 1973, the effort had essentially collapsed, and the world settled into the system that still exists. Today, where major currencies float against each other with no metal backing anything at all. Their value determined purely by market confidence, interest rates, and the credibility of the governments that issue them. It's worth being fair to the men who made this decision. They were not acting out of grand ideological ambition to remake global finance. They were responding, real and mounting pressure, to a system that had become mathematically unsustainable. One where the promise underlying the entire structure could no longer actually be honored if enough people asked for it to be. In that narrow sense, something had to give, and arguably, it was better managed as a deliberate policy. Choice than as a chaotic, forced default. But the manner of that choice, made by a handful of men in a weekend retreat, to announce without any international negotiation, television, interrupting entertainment programming. Quote, tells you something important about how decisions of enormous global consequence actually get made, not always through the visible machinery of treaties and parliaments, but sometimes through a small circle of officials in a room, deciding what everyone else would simply have to accept as fact by Monday morning. Not because it's backed by gold, since nothing backs it but faith in the American government's ability to manage its own currency responsibly, a faith that Nixon's Sunday night announcement revealed could be redefined, entirely and irreversibly, by a handful of people who never had to ask anyone's permission first. If this kind of deep dive into the hidden financial history behind the headlines is what you come here for, consider subscribing to Discount Window.